So maybe we can take George Washington for example. He's a great place to start if you're going to start with presidents. But you said earlier that the increasing complexity of the modern world is one of the factors that makes the presidency much more difficult to manage than in the past. So whether that's managing crises or increasing sophistication of culture, globalization, the legal system, etc. What were the primary objectives of the Washington presidency that were so salient he was able to focus on them?
He had one.
Okay, that makes it really easy.
Yeah, it was to create a country that did not exist yet. The Constitution put on paper a plan, but it was not a country yet. Most people living in what we would come to call the United States did not call themselves Americans. So people in Georgia called themselves Georgians. People in Massachusetts called themselves whatever people in Massachusetts call themselves, Massachusettsans, I don't know. But they did not refer to themselves as Americans. They did not think of themselves as one country. And why would they, right? They had been part of the British Empire, and they had been governed at a state level on a day-to-day basis. His job as president was to make people think of themselves as Americans, to bring them together. One of my favorite moments is when he visits Newport, Rhode Island. One of the things he did as president was travel around the country, around what was then the small country. He would actually go and stay at local inns. And he was trying to get people to see a value in cooperating with people in other parts of the country who sometimes you couldn't even understand, who had different religions, who were seen as so different in so many ways. In Newport, he's greeted at the first synagogue in the United States by the Jewish community there, and they thank him for tolerating Jews in the United States. And your listeners can look this up. It's a beautiful letter that Washington writes in response in his own hand. And he basically says, in the United States, in this new country, we don't tolerate Jews. They are part of our country. Everyone who follows our laws and contributes is an American. And everyone who follows our laws and contributes wants to be an American because you will benefit from being an American. So you are not tolerated as subjects of a king. You are part of a community where we are all one, even in our differences, right? Pluralism, unity, and diversity. And it's a beautiful statement of really what he's selling, the image he's creating. This is a narrative, it's a story, and he does it so well. It's crucial to creating our country.
Do you think that, naturally different times call for different actions, what Biden has to do is very different in actual circumstances from what Washington had to do. But in the same sense that Washington's primary mandate was to create a country that did not exist yet, do you see a primary function of the president as maintaining this sense of Americanism that Washington helped to establish?
Absolutely. I think this is still the most important job of the president. It's why we have a president. And my frustration as a historian is to see the evidence that over time, that it's not that presidents don't think that's important. They spend less and less time on that because they get pulled in other directions. It's sort of like presidents are doing all the little stuff and not the big stuff, because the little stuff is the stuff coming into their email box. It's the little stuff is the stuff that's on the headlines, right? Think about any day and look at what the president has to respond to, whether Democrat or Republican, this scandal, this attack, but not the big stuff. And presidents need to focus on the big stuff. It's often why presidents like wars, because wars give them a chance at least to try to argue what the big purpose is. But even that is not the right way to do it.
This then seems to just add to the mounting problems that constitute the impossibility of the presidency, because on the one hand, if one of the president's primary goals should be to increase this sense of American identity, the entire campaign is built around the differences between the two parties and this sense of competition.
Correct. And this is why, until the late 19th century, people who were running for president did not campaign. They had others campaign for them. It wasn't that there weren't campaigns, but it was unseemly. Theodore Roosevelt's really the first person to actively campaign. It was unseemly because you were supposed to be above that. You would have your surrogates out there attacking others and telling stories and lying and all that sort of stuff. But you were supposed to be above it. If you were Ulysses Grant or an Abraham Lincoln or whomever. You are supposed to be above that. And the founding fathers would be horrified to look at our campaigns today, and they would be horrified to see the ways, just as you say, that presidential candidates intentionally try to alienate and tear their opponents apart.
And we certainly, in retrospect, view Washington as this mythical sort of figure who was above campaigning. Did you ever see 300? I'm sure you must have seen 300. Yeah. I think Zack Snyder, I don't know if it ever happened, but he was going to make a similar movie with Washington as the star, which would have been so cool. But what I'm wondering is we view in the present, or we think of Washington in the present as having united the country. But at the time, despite this letter, in actuality, did he do anything specific? Did he represent this figurehead that at the time made people? He did. Okay.
Yes, but let's also get our terms clear, right? Unity is not 100%. There's never been a time when 100% of the, Thomas Jefferson had his doubts about George Washington. He thought George Washington didn't emphasize individual rights enough. So unity is not 100%. Unity is somewhere in the range of 60 to 70%. For a large country, that's unity, right? And so what did Washington do so successfully? He invested his prestige. He invested his time. He invested the work he did as president in building institutions that brought people together, as well as selling an image. Let me give you some examples, right? The financial system that's created, right? Taking over the debt from the states, creating the basis for a central economy and the management of interstate commerce, provided everyone an interest in being part of this larger economy. He invests early on in the idea of creating a national education system, national roads, infrastructure, right? These are all policies that everyone can benefit from. There's still those who are naysayers, but the vast majority of those who come to call themselves Americans see these as policies that actually help them, and they see themselves therefore invested in this new thing called the United States.
Something that immediately jumps out at me, as you mentioned, infrastructure, the public policy. Today, the checks and balances of the branches of government seem to effectively hamstring the president's abilities to unilaterally act on and achieve his priorities. And my understanding from reading, because I am woefully historically uninformed, is that this is precisely what Jefferson was trying to accomplish as he helped to set all of this up. So how was it that Washington was able to be so effective with the government operating around him as it was constructed?
He did very little by executive fiat. He actually did most of what he did with congressional approval. And this is the point. He persuaded citizens to persuade their members of Congress to actually do these things, right? And there was gerrymandering then, but not to the same extent as today. And that generation of policymakers in Congress, they were political, they were venal in their own ways, but they actually wanted to get shit done. And the problem today is certain people are elected to office in both parties who think they benefit more from not getting things done than from getting things done. And that's kind of on us as voters, right?
Huh. No, that sounds exactly like how government should work. You persuade the citizens to persuade the representatives to get things accomplished in government. So other than one item you mentioned, that today's representatives might have disincentives and they might not want to get things done, what are some of the other reasons that government doesn't work this way to support the president? One thing is the increased bipartisanship, but...
Well, so, there are a couple of things. One is, I think the main one is this big one, that people see short-term political value in not getting things done and railing against the system, especially in a world of social media that plays well, right? But I think there are a couple other things. Some of the policy issues are really complex and people give up. Take healthcare, for example, right? Healthcare is a really complex issue. There's a real problem in the United States that a lot of Americans don't have healthcare. A lot of young people don't have healthcare. Some of my graduate students, right? They have to stay in it. They have to worry about their where they're going to get healthcare after they get their PhD if they don't go immediately into a professorial job, right? I mean, so that's a really big issue. But on the other hand, we don't want to go to a system that's so regimented that you don't get to choose your doctor, right? And so it's really complicated, and a lot of people just give up. And also the complexity allows people to make strong arguments without evidence that scare people. So fear is a big part of this. And then I think one of the other things that's really important to recognize is that a lot of the policy problems we have require a degree of concentration and focus of resources. And back to this point we've made before, we're investing in trying to solve so many problems that we never invest enough in solving the few problems we might be able to solve. That's what I think about with climate change. It's not that we haven't tried to do things, but it's one of so many issues that if we really wanted to do something about climate change, we'd have to make it more of a priority and do less of other things, not just add it to our list.
Yeah, and healthcare, just going back to that, it brings us back to the mission creep and the increasing complexity of the modern world. So if you only have a few issues to deal with, there's also less room for disagreements. And then the complexity also makes things difficult for the average citizen to understand and then voice to their representatives. So, I mean, sure, I have moral intuitions about how healthcare ought to work, but no serious business experience or economic understanding.
Precisely. And this is the paradox of our time, Robinson, that we are more educated as Americans than we've ever been. We are more educated in many parts of the world than we've ever been, but we get less done. Being more educated has not actually kept pace with the greater complexity of the issues. And that's a real challenge we face.
Actually, this is totally tangential, but when I spoke to Victor Davis Hanson on the show, he told me that, and he's older than you, naturally, but he told me that when he was a graduate student, he thinks people learned way more than they learn now in getting a PhD. And he suspects that this was even more so 50 years earlier. Do you have that sense that your graduate students are learning as much or less or more than you were when you were in school?
I think my graduate students are learning more. I'm pretty sure they are. I'm making sure they learn more. Well, I had great advisors, but I think there's not the same body of knowledge there was. So what Victor is saying, which I think is correct, is that for a given body of knowledge, they learned more then because they focused more on that body of knowledge. But now the body of knowledge has changed, it's larger. And so they learn more, but not necessarily the same things that Victor learned. Let me just give one example of this. Our graduate students today read more written about U.S. history by non-Americans than they did when I was a graduate student. It was just more part of the profession. I'm sure it's true in philosophy as well. We're able to, thanks to the world of the internet, we can get journal articles from around the world. We can keep up with what other people are doing. So they're reading a more diverse set of authors. And I mean diversity in the sense of internationalism. But that might mean, therefore, that there are some authors in the U.S. they're not reading as much of because they're reading more authors from somewhere else. But I think they're reading more. I think they're under more pressure. I just think that their work is less concentrated and it's a different body of knowledge.
Okay. But you don't see it as possibly the case that people spent more hours 50 years ago, 20 years ago in their studies than they do now?
No, I don't think so at all. No, I don't think so at all. No, I think we have this image, right, of the 18th or 19th century scholar, just working away in the library. But in fact, much of graduate school in the 18th and 19th centuries, and the U.S. didn't even really have grad schools in the 19th century, was very much about networking and drinking and all these other things that, no, the past always seems better in that sense, right? Everyone thinks the kids were better in their school when they were a kid than now, and that's not right.
Yeah, I also think now that you mentioned the 18th and 19th century, though, I'm going to go back a little bit earlier to the scientific revolution. But when we think about earlier scholars, we think about Aristotle and Plato or Francis Bacon or Isaac Newton. And of course, when we think about those people and then look at the people at the desk next to us, they're completely different. So there's a real selection issue here.
Totally. It's like saying, right, this is a really good point. It's like saying, people don't jump as high as they used to because Michael Jordan jumped higher, right? No, Michael Jordan jumped higher, but the average basketball player, I think, now jumps higher than the average player when Jordan played. So don't compare to the Isaac Newton or the Michael Jordan, right?
Well, I guess returning for one moment to the thread that we were just on before I derailed us momentarily, I'm wondering, do you see special interests as another impediment between the coherent functioning of president and government that might not have been such an issue in Washington's time?
Well, there were special interests in Washington's time. There always have been special interests. Look, people with money or people who are organized and have lots of voices behind them have always tried to get their way, not because they're corrupt, but because they think they're right and they want to get what they want to get. So, that's not a new phenomenon. But as we become a bigger country, there are more different special interests. And as we become a country where communication is more diffuse and less centralized, that's a good thing. It allows more voices to be heard. But it also, in allowing more voices to be heard, it allows more interests to lobby. And so that's a problem. And then I will say there's a problem of scale. So money has always been an issue in politics. Charles Beard wrote about this for the founders. They were representing moneyed interests. So there's always been a intersection between money and government in the United States. But now, in the last 40, 50 years, a small group of people have grown so inordinately wealthy that they are able to use that wealth almost as individuals to buy certain outcomes. And that's a scale problem. It's not that they're greedier than the Rockefellers or the Carnegies, but it's that they have even more influence now because their money is so much greater, so much more liquid, so much more available. And so the scale problem gives certain individuals and certain groups inordinate influence.
So the tycoons of today have more influence than, say, like the robber barons did?
I think so, yes. I do think so. I think the robber barons had a lot of influence as well. I don't want to diminish that. But I do think that, yes, the money that can be provided by a tech tycoon, by an Elon Musk or Sheldon Abramson or others to a candidate can be incredibly useful for that candidate to get their advertisements out, to get their message out, and that can totally shift things. And in another way of looking at it, if you can't raise money from people like that, you can't run for office. Whereas in the 19th century, you still could.
Okay, well, switching gears, I guess, to something that you said earlier when you were laying out the main problems of the impossible presidency. So today, our government and the presidency seems largely it's not predicated just on preserving peace at home, but power abroad and power absolutely, which I don't think that at the time of Washington there was this imperialist ambition. So is that one way in which the government and the presidency has changed that makes it so much more difficult?
Absolutely. It's become global, right? The presidency of Washington and Andrew Jackson and Abraham Lincoln cared about continental matters. So anyone who studies the history of American Indians, Native peoples, will say there's long been a push to expand and the use of force to expand into different areas. And the railroad robber barons, we've referred to some of them, Leland Stanford is one of them, right? They were building on Indian land in many cases. So there is this longstanding imperialist element to the presidency that goes back even to Washington, but it was more bounded. It was continental. Now it's global. And think about it. There was recently an attempted coup in Niger, and that became an issue for President Biden. He has to respond to that. The Chinese government is threatening Taiwan. He has to respond to that. War in Ukraine. He has to respond to that. Disorder in Haiti. He has to respond to that. So these issues multiply, and the range of people he has to work with multiply as well. And that makes it very hard to stay focused. Every day is another crisis somewhere in the world. In the 18th century, presidents didn't have to care about that. In the 21st century, they have to care about it.
Yeah, there's a really nice passage in your book about how on any given day the president might have to deal with this coup in Niger, a school shooting, the Warriors win the NBA. Like this creep, it's not just, I mean, any of these factors like globalization of military. It's all of these things coming together. But
That's right. And that's why I tried to show in the book the calendars of presidents. And to me, the most valuable resource we all have is our time. Right. I'm so grateful to those who are listening to us now because their time is the most valuable resource. Right. I'm taking time to do this. I'm grateful to listeners who are taking time. Right. Presidents, if you look at how they spend their time, it's the same problem you and I have, Robinson. We want to sit down and write an article or write a book chapter, and 18 things go on in our lives and pull us away. Right. For presidents, it's 18 million things going on. And you see that in their calendars. They almost never get to do what they really want to do.